Hello and welcome to another video of my opening series, Mastering the Basics. Today, we're gonna cover the strong and difficult play in the Maroczi Bind. One of the most annoying threats to the Sicilian defense, especially in three of the Sicilians that we're gonna cover today. The O'Kelly variation, the dragon, the accelerated dragon, or hyper accelerated dragon, and also against the Paulsen variation. Black's idea in most of these variations to avoid the Maroczi Bind. So if you didn't know how to play the Maroczi Bind and you learn after this video, you will be able to punish black in the more uncomfortable play that they can find. Another important thing about the Maroczi Bind is that if you can do the Maroczi Bind because your opponent get the order wrong and you have the chance of playing the Maroczi Bind, you should play the Maroczi Bind because it is the most uncomfortable way of punishing black's order mistakes. And without further ado, let's get into it. So the main thing about the Maroczi Bind, I'm gonna pick the first line here that we're gonna cover today, which is the O'Kelly variation. This is a side line that a lot of people play because they try to confuse you with the neither Sicilian or with some Sicilian where they wanna get the opponent on h6. For example, if you follow up with d4, very quickly black gets a huge amount of counterplay because of the follow-up move bishop b4. This has happened to a million of my students and it still happens today. Even at high rated level like 1800, 2000, people get this order wrong. I myself have gotten people with like 2200 with this as black. So it's a very basic idea, but everybody falls for it. So the easiest way to stop this is by not playing d4 right away, but instead go for the Maroczi Bind, punishing this weak, not center powerful move. So we are not going to take time, we're not going to waste time, and we're going to play the move c4. Now the main reason why we can afford c4 here is because black doesn't have the move e5. For example, if somebody plays the regular way, the way they're supposed to play the Najdorf or the dragon or any other lines that you play in the Sicilian, I would love to play c4 and get the Maroczi Bind again, but I cannot do it because after this move black can still play e5 and we both locked up the center, which gives up a position that's about equal. We don't want that, and that's why the Maroczi Bind in this order is not possible. The O'Kelly variation, though, allows the Maroczi Bind because black is not able to play e5 because the pawn is hanging. So whenever they go knight f6 and they finally try to go e5, we very quickly go d4, and then at that point we actually obtain the Maroczi Bind. Now this Maroczi Bind is huge because it controls the main two counterplays of black in the Sicilian. And what I want you to pay attention is that the Maroczi Bind controls too much of black's initiative. If you don't have d5 and you don't have b5, then what are you doing? Well, this is the problem. The Maroczi Bind should be avoided at all costs, in my opinion. I personally stopped playing the accelerated dragon. I don't play the Paulsen plenty of time because of the Maroczi Bind. It's the most annoying one. Now, how do you continue here? Well, we're gonna follow that up with simple development. We're gonna go bishop b2, we're gonna go castle, we're gonna go bishop b3, and then you're doing really well. Okay, so for example, let's just play one of my games. A lot of these will actually cover in another order that we transpose to. People just do this and you finally get to a very comfortable position. This rook comes to c1, and then you can play b3, or you can play a3 and b4, you can play f3 and f4, and you can really feel the space that white has here. The main thing in the Maroczi Bind for white is to make sure that black never gets to play d5 or b5. And as long as you keep an eye on these two moves, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. You can even go king h1, come back to g1 if you need to, but slowly improve. But don't let the d5 happen. That is your main target on this Maroczi Bind. We're gonna repeat the same concept basically on every single one of these opens we're gonna see today. So we started with the O'Kelly variation with this, with black plays the move a6, and then here we have to go c4 because we don't want to play d4. And now you know what to do. Now we're gonna move on into the Paulsen Sicilian, which is actually the main line that we're gonna cover on this. But we're not gonna go with the Paulsen yet because that will be the final line to finish the video. We're gonna start with now the dragon. So there are many different types of dragons. We have covered the regular dragons, which starts with d6. You do need to understand why this matters. But we haven't covered what's called the accelerated dragon or the hyper accelerated dragon. Against both of these dragons, the best way, the best punishment for them is also the Maroczi Bind. For example, if you go on G6, this is called the hyper accelerated dragon. We're gonna start with D4. It is possible to also go C4, then knight C3, then D4, or D4 as soon as possible. We want to get that pawn trade because that's what makes the Maroczi Bind. When this pawn is straight off by the D and this, for the D pawn is straight over the C pawn, and we keep the E pawn and the C pawn on E4, C4, that's when we have the Maroczi Bind, right? So here we also have time because black doesn't have the move E5. So we could do that too, but I'm just gonna get it to so we get a similar position. Now I'm again threatening to go C4. If you play knight C6, as you can see, I just go ahead on C4. I always want the Maroczi Bind whenever I can. If I have time to do it, if my opponent allows me to, I want to push the pawn on C4 before I develop my knight. Sometimes though, it's not possible. For example, if black plays knight F6 here, we are being attacked. So we need to play knight C3, and that's when we don't have anymore the Maroczi Bind. But in this case, we're actually forcing black to get back into the regular dragon because D6 is the only move here not to get much worse because I'm threatening the very annoying move E5. If you play D6 for this one, you can go back and check my video on the dragon because this is officially a normal, or what is also called regular dragon. There's also the knight C6 move to stop E5, but in this case, knight takes knight, pawn takes E5, pawn takes E6, and E5 is just already very, very powerful for black. Sorry, for white. You can find many, many good games on this position, followed by queen F3, castle. Very, very strong attack for white. And basically, this is not recommended for black, and that's why at this point here, black has to actually allow the Maroczi Bind, or they can get back into a regular dragon. No, most of the time you're gonna play bishop G7, and we're officially back into the regular accelerated dragon. So we started with the hyper accelerated dragon, that's move 2 with G6. Now we're gonna go into the normal or regular accelerated dragon, which is knight C6. Here we're gonna go D4, pawn takes D4, knight takes D4 again, right? We're gonna start with D4 this time. The main reason for that is because again, black is trying to play E5. We don't have the move C4 because of E5. Anytime E5 is possible, you cannot play the Maroczi Bind, or you cannot play the move C4. You have to go for D4 first, and that's why it's important to get D4 now. And then now, well, depending on what you do here, you can make, again, you can transpose into many Sicilians here. But we're trying to cover the lines that can get into the Maroczi Bind, that you should play the Maroczi Bind. This is the accelerated round, the regular accelerated round that we're gonna answer with C4. Once again, you notice that the pawn is not being attacked. That's why I'm allowed to play the move C4. G6, C4, bang. And we got back into a Maroczi Bind. And again, anytime you get into this type of position, you just have to do it. Just believe me. Play the Maroczi Bind, learn how to play it, and you're gonna be fine. Now against bishop G7, always play bishop B3. There's no danger on these. Any move like queen B6 can be answered with something like knight B5. Attacks the queen, protects the pawn, followed by knight C3, and you're totally fine. The knight can come back here when you kick me. It's totally fine. Black just lost time. Now, if you don't do that, the most logical move would be, well, the follow-up is knight F6. There are two ways of playing here. Anytime the knight comes here, you protect it with the knight on C3. This is standard for any Sicilian. You now need to control the knight G4. So, for example, a move like D6, trying to go knight G4, you just go bishop B2. You can also probably even go F3. It doesn't really matter. Just keep an eye on the easy tactics and bang. You notice the similarities. We are basically doing the exact same thing on against the Paulsen or against the dragon, accelerated dragon. We're not gonna play F3 to protect this pawn. We're gonna put the pawn on B3 to protect C4, and we're gonna put the rook on C1 to put the rook protecting the knight on C3, and to have some pressure on the C file later, which can follow with knight B5. Once again, you notice the similarities, right? You're seeing a pattern here where the way we're setting up our pieces, because this is really good for white against any Sicilian. Now that we covered the dragons, the two dragons that a lot of the time transpose into the same, there's actually one more that I want to show you that can be a little more tricky, which is D4, but it's similar. C4, in this case, black goes knight F6 first. Well, you know that when the knight attacks this pawn, we always defend the pawn. Now, with the pawn on C4 is very, very good for us. Black can go D6 to try to go attack this knight G4 if you go bishop B3, and that's when we go bishop B2, knight takes D4. In this case, the knight takes first. I know a very important line to learn. Bishop B3. The most important thing for most of the dragon is that whenever that queen is sitting on D4 and the move knight G4 is finally possible, like in this case, the bishop is protected. You see one move before, this bishop was not protected, so you couldn't do knight G4. You got to pay attention to that, and you got to move that queen away. I recommend here, there are two very good moves here. You can play queen D2 or queen D3. I actually really like the move queen D3. It's very interesting. Probably one of the best ideas, queen d3 to protect this pawn and this pawn. They're both very good. I think queen d2 is also very comfortable. Great position for white. You again keep those pawns there, not allowing d5, b5. Good to go. Same idea. You're castling. You're playing f3. You're just keeping an eye on easy tactics, and then you'll have a long-term advantage. All right. So the last line we're gonna cover today is the Paulsen Sicilian. Very popular and extremely complex line to learn. When you play d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. In this position, black has again many moves that can transpose. We talked about the Taimanov. I recommend watching that video that I had already made. Is on my YouTube channel, where I recommend you how to play against the Taimanov variation, which is the knight c6 with this moment knight c6 of the Paulsen. But I have not talked about the main Paulsen variation, which is a6. And the best way to punish the Paulsen is also with the Maroczi Bind. Once again, we see that Maroczi set up. We want to go knight c3. We're going to go bishop b2. We're going to go bishop b3. Queen somewhere, castle. Same idea. But in the Paulsen, it's a little difficult because there is this bishop on b4 that we don't have in the dragon or in the other lines that we've seen so far. In this case, we do have to deal with this bishop b4 pin, and we're going to deal with it in a very specific way. So first thing, black goes knight f6, attacks the pawn as usual. We're going to protect that pawn. And then here there are two ways of playing. The main line is actually queen c7, a waiting move, so that if you play bishop b2, I want to go bishop b4. Now, the main reason why this move is important in the Paulsen is because white wants to play the move pawn e5, forcing you to go back to where you came from. Notice that e5 is not possible. Extremely typical blunder. I did it myself when I was a little kid. Black check on a5 and you lose the pawn. This is something you cannot fall for. You can only threaten e5 once you have the knight sitting on c3. So when I play knight c3 in any Sicilian, I'm threatening e5 as a move, right? Especially in the Paulsen because nobody is attacking this pawn. So the move queen c7 is to stop the move e5. Now, the best move against queen c7, well, you can probably guess. We're trying to stop bishop b4. You can still go bishop b2 and it's fine, but I really like the move that was played by Magnus in a very good game, a3. And it played by many top players. a3, just a simple move. Yeah, it's a little annoying to have to move this pawn here, but it is so much comfortable to develop now when we don't have to deal with the pin. And guess what? We're going to start going bishop b2, bishop b3, and castle. The same exact development. So now, black plays something like b6. Is a very typical. I encountered this. You can find some of my games on the database as well. Bishop b7 attacking the pawn. Once again, we have to protect that pawn. You can do f3, but I really like the move queen d3. This is again another very unique move that I've played myself plenty of times. F3 is totally fine as well. Queen d3 is just, we keep seeing this queen d3. It's very useful though because you protect e4, you protect c4, so it gives you more freedom with your pawn structure to push a little more forward. For example, this game that I play, you have to be careful with knight b d7, knight c5, knight e5. Coming, we're attacking this pawn and this pawn. That's why we have to go b4, for example, to control the knight, jumping to c5, and when the knight comes to d7, we play f4 to control e5 and c5. So now this knight that had an idea in mind is not able to do anything. And, you know, we can follow this by developing castling and developing the bishop. In this case, I developed the bishop this way, but I also, again, you can just play bishop b3. The beauty of the Maroczi Bind is that as long as you're not losing any of these pawns, especially the e pawn and the c pawn, and you stop d5 and b5, you can develop pretty much any way, and you're totally fine. You have too much space. I wanted to just point out how much space you have in this position. It's just very strong. And then the rook comes to c1 to target that indirect queen there, sitting on the c7 file. There's also knight d5 coming. It's very good for white. So the last thing I wanted to touch, it is this game that I'm putting as the main game on this line, is that what happens when I go knight c3 and black pin me. A lot of people probably will be wondering what to do against this. Well, once again, we got to protect this knight, but more than anything, we got to protect this pawn. Once again, we see this beautiful move, queen d3, that is awesome. Trying to still go e5. We still want to go e5. We couldn't do it now because black has knight e4 and black is fine. So we have to make this beautiful move, queen d3. I'm not going to go too deep into this game. You can find this game online on database. Nepomniachtchi just crashed as builder. It was a blitz game, but it was played like a computer, so it is worth seeing. Black play here, queen c7, trying to stop e5. It's worth to point out that if bishop takes c3, we don't really want to lose the pawn, even though it would totally be fine. This position is way more than compensation for white, for the pawn, because of this monster bishop and the dark squares being so weak. But the easiest way to do is to actually take with the pawn. You don't mind giving up the double pawns, because what you get is too much for black to handle. Look at this guy. The bishop's too strong. So black goes queen c7 to make it a little more difficult for white to play e5, but Maroczi goes a3. Bishop takes c3, and now, well, most of the time you would think, oh, let's take with the b pawn. Well, now we don't have the bishop on a3. This will still be better for white because the bishop pair compensate for the double isolated pawns. You might have to move the pawn forward and then push the bishop this way. But Maroczi has something better in mind. He takes with the queen, and after knight takes e4, there's a bang in this position that's just unbelievable. Knight b5, which is some crushing winning position. I don't want to go too deep into this game, but after knight b5, white is completely winning because of the idea of queen takes g7 followed by some crushing moves that, you know, you should definitely analyze with the computer to understand what's happening, or just simply look at the game and basically just follow what the game did. It was perfectly played by Maroczi. And this is, again, just to give you an idea, guys, on how to play against the Maroczi Bind. One of the most useful structures to learn in chess, where you can punish many people who play random stuff or random orders that they're not supposed to. I'm just gonna give you one more line here, just to give you an idea. The thing that I've seen on many games online and some of my students, where they're playing a Sicilian, they open the Sicilian, and people don't play knight f6 right after you break the pawn structure. So notice that we just played d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, and everybody here should play knight f6. But some people forget about the importance of playing knight f6 to force the knight to come to c3 and to not let c4 happen. But a lot of people, they're like, oh, I want to play the knight off, and they think that this is the same. It's not the same, because if I play the knight off and I get the Maroczi Bind, I'm playing the Maroczi Bind. I don't want to play the knight. I don't want to play anything. I just want to play Maroczi Bind set up, and I'm good. So this is an example. You got to be watching for this. Somebody also get the dragon pawn, play g6 too early. I'm playing Maroczi Bind again, right? Anytime I'm playing Maroczi Bind. So hopefully you guys use the Maroczi Bind more. It's an incredible line, or an incredible setup to learn. Very easy to play for white. Play for 2 results. I hope you have fun, and go ahead and play it. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.